SubaHibi is a very unusual reading experience. My first thoughts a few hours into the visual novel as I was playing were, why am I reading this weird, yuri, ecchi slice of life? But a few hours later, I was hooked into reading about a young man who starts an apocalyptic death cult. And after that, it turned into an extremely brutal, painful to read story about a girl losing her innocence. And then it was about a man's profound internal struggle between multiple personalities, and so on and so forth. It's not easy to sum up SubaHibi. The reason I say reading it is an experience is because I felt every single emotion during my time with the story. Literally everything that can be felt by a person. Fear, indignance, depression, inspiration, despair, lust, both hope and hopelessness, disgust, heartbreak, acceptance, you name it, I felt it. This video essay is basically just gonna be me vomiting my thoughts about the game in an extremely disorganized manner, but can you really blame me? I mean, where do you even start when talking about SubaHibi? There were certain points where everything I thought I knew about a certain part of a story or a character was completely turned on its head. But despite its unpredictability, it still all made sense and felt natural. When people mention this game, they often say how it's shocking, horrifying, absurd, and they're right, it is all of those things. But it goes beyond just shock value or horrific imagery. After a standard horror movie, I turn it off and don't feel scared at all. But with something like this, there was often a sort of existential dread that would stay with me for a while after a reading session. It poses some tough questions about life, death, and all the suffering that comes in between. If I had to describe SubaHibi with a single word, it would be raw. Everything just feels real. When the characters are engaging in lighthearted banter, you feel it. When they're suffering, you really feel it. The story was able to get me so invested in these characters. So without further ado, let's just go over some of the characters. At the center of the story, we have Mamiya Takoji. My first impression of him was that he was comparable to Shinji Ikari from Evangelion, and I suppose the similarities are there at a glance. The Takoji we follow during It's My Own Invention is a massive social outcast who has been abused by his family and peers. He is passive, timid, basically the opposite of what you could call a happy, well-adjusted person. Very relatable for all of us otaku reading this, I know. But he is not a self-insert. This man has layers. The event that triggers him to snap is the self-deletion of his classmate, Takashima Zakuro. Why did this event set him off? Well, upon meeting the girl, he had two back-to-back delusional masturbatory fantasies of her, but more importantly than that, she was quite possibly the only real, positive connection he made with the classmate. But that is promptly ripped away from him, and he quickly loses whatever shred of sanity he was holding on to. He meets Riruru, and during their conversation, a dramatic shift takes place in his personality. He goes from a kid who just wants to avoid his bullies, to believing himself to be God incarnate, to have lived for billions of years and acquired all human knowledge and experience, and the one who is destined to save humanity. This is quite possibly one of the greatest insane characters I've seen in all of fiction. During It's My Own Invention, which is probably my favorite route in and of itself, even though it's explicitly clear that Takoji is insane and delusional, I constantly found myself thinking, dang, he's pretty compelling, maybe he really is the savior. And I love how after finishing Jabberwocky Part 2, it suddenly makes a lot more sense why Takoji did the things that he did. During the first reading of Invention, all we know is that he seemingly just snapped and did his cult thing because of his abuse or trauma. We were told about his mother's prophecy, but we weren't aware just how deep and twisted his relationship with his mother truly was. The crucifixion scene seems to kind of come out of left field. Takoji says that the reason he's crucifying Kagami is because of a black surge or whatever, but the reality is that he was intent on destroying the symbol of Tomosane's love for his sister. It also makes a lot more sense why Tomosane was kind of the final boss for Takoji. Overall, Invention was a really great route, and it's probably the route where the most action happens, but it's definitely only just one piece of the puzzle. Looking Glass Insects is another extremely significant route, and it diverges into the main ending and the Kimika ending. But the main ending was, to me, one of the most gut-wrenching, difficult things to read in this entire visual novel. It starts out very lighthearted, calm before the storm. Zakuro mentions that she was bullied, but it stopped, and she seems to be doing okay for the most part, although she's obsessed with escapism, specifically the novel Alice in Wonderland. She's looking for excitement and intrigue in her life, and soon enough she finds it when she meets the Yuki version of Takoji. Despite being unimpressed and put off by, we'll call it the base version of Takoji, she becomes smitten with Yuki and goes on the cute date and all that. However, once the bullying resumes, things start getting really bad. What makes this situation so tragic is that Zakuro is by all means a great human being. No one can hate Zakuro. Her only character flaw is her naivete, but it's quite sad that often the best people get the worst treatment by society. The stuff she has to go through in this route is pretty horrifying, and I commend the author for being able to make me feel exhausted just by reading this, and how the moment when just when you think she's out of the woods, the worst happens. But anyway, Looking Glass Insects has two very different endings. Quite possibly the most positive and the most negative endings in the entire story. And I think it's important to analyze what happened in the story that caused the divergence between the positive and the negative outcome for Zakuro. The key factor that separates the Zakuro who jumped from the one who found happiness in life is courage and the willingness to stand up for her friend. If you'll recall, when they're in the restaurant and the girls are forcing Kimika to make the video, Zakuro stands up to them by reciting her poetry and manages to save Kimika. In the main ending, however, Zakuro just reacts passively to this incident and all the other bullying she receives. Eventually, the bullying culminates until she reaches a breaking point, and once the bullies have pretty much ruined her life, all she does is wish death upon them, which I can't really blame her for, but she's even warned by Ayana that she's going down the wrong path. Zakuro finds the other girls who have been through some similar situations and makes a pact with them. She convinces herself that all her suffering was necessary in order to save the world or whatever, and then that's all she wrote. Pretty depressing overall, but now contrast that with the Kimika ending. In that ending, the two girls support each other and stand up to their bullies. The fight is difficult and brutal. It's stated multiple times that Kimika is quite weak, yet she still manages to fight using her ingenuity. I found this route very thrilling and enjoyable, and it has a much more positive message. Zakuro develops courage and the ability to stand up for herself, and as a result she overcomes her problems and gets to live a happy life instead of giving in. I'll also add that Kimika is extremely adorable in this route, and I consider her the best girl and the best side character in the entire game. Now for Jabberwocky. Tomosane is one of the cutest and most compelling tsunderes I have ever seen. He actually has a very good reason for being Tsun towards Yuki and his sister. He believes himself to be the destroyer, His role is to destroy Takoji's personality and himself in the process, leaving behind only Yuki, which is the personality that Takoji wished for. Given the circumstances, it's quite reasonable to expect him to be cold towards the girls. If he got close with them only to fade away, it would only hurt them. More than anything, he just wants to achieve his goal of defeating Takoji. Jabberwocky is a decent chapter, but just like with It's My Own Invention, there's a lot that doesn't make sense until you read Jabberwocky Part 2. The reason behind his vitriolic hatred towards Takoji isn't really explained until Part 2, and the same goes for the sibling love. I know it was being hinted at, but that still really came out of left field for me and felt awkward. However, looking back on it, after you see the true depth of their relationship in Part 2, it becomes a lot more compelling, and it didn't feel at all like the author was just trying to shoehorn his fetish in. Regardless, I quite enjoyed the conclusion of Jabberwocky. Tomo develops to the point where he realizes his relationships are meaningful, and he was wrong to try to push Yuki and Hasaki away. I don't have much to say about the Hasaki route, except for the fact that the ending really made me sad. It just ends with her going off the roof with him, but of course we later find out the true resolution to this scene. I enjoyed Hasaki as a character overall. I get that she doesn't have as much personality as some of the other girls, but I think that makes sense given the abuse she suffered under her mother. She was raised to be docile and passive. I thought it was really cute how the reason she likes rabbits is because she wanted to feel needed by someone, as she lived her entire life feeling like a burden, completely unwanted. And as I said earlier, I can sort of see why she fell for Tomosane. Jabber Part 2 is where everything gets unraveled and the puzzle finally comes together. We learn the true backstory of how the real Takoji was killed, and whether Takoji possessed Tomosane or Tomosane just developed a psychological condition of having multiple personalities is left up to the reader to decide. But at the most critical moment, Tomosane emerges from the struggle victorious. He seizes control from Takoji as he plummets and manages to save himself and his sister, and resolves to live happily. And that's the story. The rest of this video is going to be mostly philosophical, talking about the central themes and messages. Let me preface this section with a huge disclaimer that this analysis will keep the discussion of metaphysics to a bare minimum, and there are a few reasons for this. The first is because I'm honestly just too much of a midwit to contribute to the discussion here in any meaningful way. I can't pretend that I understand Tracticus Logico Philosophicus and that this eroge gave me a bunch of profound revelations about metaphysics and the nature of reality that changed my life forever, because that would be a lie. Secondly, I think that there are a lot of interesting theories about the story. I've read the blog post about Ayana being a schizo and whatnot, and I think these types of posts have some good ideas, but at the same time kind of miss the forest for the trees. First, it just isn't possible to reach a definitive answer regarding some of the stuff here. In N-Sky 2, when Yuki is basically asking, what on earth is happening? Why am I here? This world is completely incomprehensible. Ayana offers several different perspectives that could explain reality, and the key word there is perspective. Any one of Ayana's explanations regarding the nature of reality could potentially be true, so I don't know how much sense it makes to postulate and say, this here is what really definitively happened in the story. That's why this is only going to be an analysis of ethics as opposed to metaphysics. In other words, I'm not interested in asking stuff like, what is the nature of reality, but rather, how does the author say we should live? And this is all just my subjective interpretation. In fact, it's extremely subjective. There's a ton of different ways you could go with this, so I'd love to hear your interpretation down in the comments. I agree with a significant portion of Scotty's viewpoints and philosophies here. Definitely not 100%. There are some disagreements which I'll get into, but just so you're aware of my biases, my own philosophical beliefs align most closely with Albert Camus' absurdism. I do not believe Camus or absurdism is explicitly referenced within the novel. If I'm wrong, let me know. And I'm not sure if it's coincidence or if I'm just choosing to interpret the story in a way that confirms my own biases and beliefs, probably the latter. But I think you can make a case for the life philosophy the author puts forward being at least tangentially related to absurdism. But I'm getting way ahead of myself, so I need to rewind for a moment and talk about the central questions and themes before I make my case. I think the core question SubaHibi asks is how we can find meaning in a world that is so rife with suffering and chaos. From the beginning of It's My Own Invention, we are presented with a broken young man. He has been treated horribly by the people around him, and he has no meaning in life. Or scratch that. He actually does have a meaning, but let's just say it's a tad questionable. But in his first dialogue with Riruru, he questions the meaning of life, and at first he claims that the meaning of life is to pass on your genes. This is a fairly common answer people often give when asked about the meaning of life. I often hear it from pseudo-intellectual Redditors and the like, and I think that while this may be correct in a scientific sense, saying that the only meaning of life is to reproduce is a pretty stupid and short-sighted answer. After all, there are plenty of people who may hate their lives despite having reproduced, and others who don't pass on their genes, but have still found meaning in their lives. Riruru correctly points out that even if he does pass on his genes, that whole process will not continue forever in the grand scheme of things. And after this dialogue, he ends up arriving at the conclusion that his purpose and meaning is to fulfill his mother's goal of returning the world to the sky. In other words, you can think of Takoji's solution to meaning as going full schizo-pilled. I don't really recommend this, but if you want to believe yourself to be the avatar of God and the savior of humanity and start your own cult or whatever, who am I to stop you? I already talked about Takashima Zakuro's character arc a bit, but I'll add a little more here. The crux of her story is that you need to find the courage to stand up and fight whatever is holding you down, whether that be a person or anything in the world that's trying to screw you. In the main ending, she ends up wallowing in her victimhood and deluding herself, which is understandable as she certainly did not deserve to go through what she did. But the end result of that path is that you stay miserable and self-delete. But in the Kimika route, she finds meaning through developing courage and her relationship with Kimika. Tomosane, at the start of Jabberwocky Part 1, is kind of a special case in terms of how he finds meaning. He actually starts off with a meaning, and a very clear one at that. But he evolves from his original meaning of just wanting to kill Takoji to finding meaning through his bonds with Yuki and Hasaki. Hasaki, as I mentioned earlier, finds meaning in wanting to support and be supported by another person. This may come off as a bizarre tangent, but there is one matter that I really disagree with the author about here, and that is the nature of evil. I'll explain. The more you learn about Kotomi's character and her backstory and her actions, the less you like her. She cucked her husband, got duped into joining a cult, acted abusively towards her children, etc. All around, she made many mistakes, to put it lightly, and in my mind, she's an unambiguous POS. However, at the very end of the story, when Tomosane and Hasaki are visiting their mother, there's a long explanation about how Kotomi was actually, in her mind, doing the right thing, and that she was just misguided, but she really did love her husband and children, and the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and all that blah blah blah. And yeah, I get all that. Everyone's the hero in their own story. Everyone can rationalize their crappy behavior and all that. But the implication put forth here is that because Kotomi thought that she was doing the right thing, she can somehow be forgiven and there should be no ill will towards her. Perhaps forgiveness is good and all that, but I want you to really think about this for a minute. This woman ruined several people's lives for no good reason, and it was all because of her ignorance and cruelty. I just don't buy the whole empathy and sympathy for her. It's my own view that some people are irredeemably toxic and twisted, and maybe you can rationalize and empathize with them, but sometimes it's just not worth it. And if you disagree with me, here's my counterpoint. I present to you these two. Go ahead and try to rationalize their behavior and tell me how we should forgive them. I dare you. In case you forgot, these two made Kimika and Zakuro's lives a living hell, and were willing to go as far as to have them forcibly deflowered. And what was their rationale for this behavior? It was because their boyfriends said that they were cute. It's good to have empathy and all, but it's my opinion that some people in life will simply inflict suffering on others, and sometimes they might have a good reason, or they might not. But that's the end of that tangent. Back to the core philosophies. Most of what the author explicitly says about meaning and purpose in life can be found at the very end of Jabberwocky Part 2, when Tomosane has finally seized control over his body once again. That is when the core message is really driven home. The message isn't very complicated at a glance. Live happily, it says. Just telling someone to live happily isn't very profound. In fact, it actually sounds kind of stupid. Just be happy, bro. But fortunately, this isn't all he's saying. This is a prime example of showing and not just telling. During the story, Tomosane was able to overcome levels of guilt and trauma that are absolutely unfathomable and should normally break a person. In his life up to that point, he has essentially experienced pretty much every negative thing, from loss, guilt, trauma, abuse, loneliness. After he finally accepts himself, it's no wonder that he's able to live happily. You can sense his mental clarity and peace in the way that he speaks. He's not freaking out over the legal troubles and all the other baggage he has to deal with. He's just living happily. Also, you may have noticed that there is one character that I have not talked about at all during the entire video up to this point. You can call it saving the best for last. Yuki Minakami is someone who I think embodies the ideal of live happily. She sort of acts as a rock for the other characters. She's always bantering, she doesn't take life too seriously, she pursues her own interests and goals. She's sociable and good with people, but also likes being alone. In a story filled with broken people, she is a shining beacon, a life that is well lived. There's a dialogue between Yuki and Tomosane in Jabberwocky Part 2, and my memory of it is a little rusty, but during the conversation, Yuki imagines a newborn infant, and knowing that being born is a curse because life is filled with suffering and ends with death, questions whether it would be better to snuff out the life. But she reaches the conclusion that the life of a child ought to be preserved, and that despite all of its hardships, life is still full of blessings. Death is also one of the central themes that is brought up a few times. I'd like to specifically zoom in on two particular scenes that talk about death. In one scene, Takoji gives a speech in his classroom about how the mass media and educational institutions are manipulating us because they discuss trivialities instead of talking about death, which ought to be the central, most important thing on everyone's minds, because all those other matters are completely meaningless in the face of impending total oblivion. Takoji believes. And I forget exactly when this happens, but I do remember a scene where Takoji basically confesses he's terrified of his own mortality. You see, much of what Savior Takoji does is prey on people's fear of death by prophesizing the apocalypse and offering them a way to save them. In a way, you could interpret a lot of Takoji's actions as a false savior, as stemming from his fear of death. Now let's contrast this with another scene in which Yuki talks about death. Yuki views death very differently from Takoji. She is not afraid of it, and the rationale being death is impossible for a person to experience. Animals are happy because they don't know what death is, and we also can never actually know what it is as well. I think this is a much more healthy and realistic viewpoint to hold about death. Personally, I don't see a point in agonizing over death, and as Takoji demonstrates, a lot of bad can occur as a result of trying to avoid or escape it. Everyone watching this video is going to die. There is no point in freaking out or despairing over something that is inevitable. Overall, it's very important to have a healthy, accepting attitude towards your mortality, and the story does a great job of demonstrating this. I'd also like to briefly talk about how the idea of God is portrayed in the story. For most of the novel, he is a massive douchebag. God literally laughs at an innocent high school girl whose life is basically hell. The problem of evil is brought up several times and goes unanswered for most of the story. So my initial impression was that Scotty thinks God is just a clown or a jerk who laughs in the face of our suffering. But a more nuanced position is developed towards the end. At the end of Jabberwocky Part 2, Tomoe says, quote, "To believe in God means to see that life has a meaning. God doesn't need to work miracles. He didn't create the world in 1 week. He fundamentally does nothing. Even then, he irresponsibly tells us, he whispers in our ears, that we must live happily. All he did was establish the workings of the universe, and he didn't do it for anyone's sake in particular. All the world's lies, injustices, fakes, lechers, and filth, all of those are permitted by God. No matter what injustices befall us in life, God still says to us, live happily." End quote. My guess, based on this excerpt, is that Scotty is a deist, meaning that he believes in a creator but is skeptical of organized religion and the idea that God answers prayers or intervenes in human affairs. The core takeaway I got from SubaHibi was that life is absurd, life is horrifying, life is traumatic, life is utterly incomprehensible, and yet we must live happily. That's why I chose to interpret this story under the lens of absurdism. If you're unfamiliar with Albert Camus or the philosophy of absurdism, it basically says that humans desire meaning and purpose in life. However, there is no inherent meaning or purpose in life, and this creates conflict. This means that humans are much like Sisyphus. We are on an impossible, aimless journey. Camus says that we need to embrace the absurdity of life and rebel against it. Embracing the absurdity of existence requires you to reject hopelessness and nihilism and live authentically and be very courageous in your approach to life. And I think that sums up Tomosane's character journey pretty nicely. I think that much of what Tomosane does can be classified as rebelling against the absurd. When he's possessed by Takoji, he hides away from the world and only pursues pleasure and escapism, and he has to delude himself in order to find meaning in life. But at the end of the story, Tomosane learns to cope with his trauma and find meaning in his life. I think it's such a beautiful message, really. Thanks for listening to my ramblings. I don't even know if anyone is still watching at this point, but it really means a lot to me if you made it this far. If you want to request an analysis of another visual novel, feel free to do so in the comments.